Oh yeah, I think there's no intro. Oh, there we go. Okay, everybody. I was getting ready for an intro. I forgot we stopped doing those. So we're good. We're live. I am here with TTP student Connor, who absolutely destroyed GMAT Focus. And I know this is a very hot topic for everyone to learn about GMAT Focus, what Connor did, how he was successful. As you can see, he got a 755 on the test, and he has a really cool, interesting story because he did take it a number of times despite doing really well the first time. So we can get right into it. I think what could be super relevant, Connor, to start is to just kind of talk about your background in general, and then we can get into some of your GMAT related stuff.
Cool. Hello everyone. I'm Connor. I first, I guess my story starts when I graduated college. I went to Cal. I graduated with a cognitive science degree and focused my studies on computer science generally. And I became a software engineer when I graduated. I worked as a software engineer for almost 4 years, first for AWS, and then I went to ZipRecruiter as well. And then unfortunately got laid off in the middle of last year. So that, of course, triggered this introspection. Where do I want to take my career? And then I settled on the MBA journey, of course, starting with GMAT preparation. So come from, just to speak in more general terms, a pretty quantitative background. Always loved math, not so much reading and writing, but I think that those skills came around once I started working with TTP.
Yes, that's very apparent in your score. So you're about 4 years out of school. You decided to, well, I guess you decided to take the GMAT because your goal is to apply. You applying next year in round one, or were you saving your GMAT score?
So I actually applied. I just finished all my applications a couple weeks ago. So I applied in round two for.
Oh wow. Okay, great. I'm sure some of the people here will be curious about that. And tell me about how, you kind of got started with the GMAT, what was kind of your initial steps? What was your baseline score? How did all that go?
So starting from the beginning, just to be very, very transparent, my GPA in college was pretty lackluster. So once I decided to pursue an MBA, do the application process, I knew that it was really important for me to get a really, really good GMAT score to kind of balance that GPA out. And this is, of course, on the advice of all the admissions committees, meetings, all those virtual sessions that they tell you to balance out your GPA with GMAT score or GRE, of course.
Right.
So I knew I had to, really be diligent in my preparation, kind of shoot for the stars, so to speak, if I wanted to have a more competitive application. So decided to invest the time, invest a little bit of money. I didn't know where to start, though, exactly. Of course, looking for a program like TTP was kind of where I pursued my efforts first. Before that, though, actually, I took a mock cold, got a 615. I felt pretty overwhelmed during the mock. I mean, the GMAT is definitely a beast of an exam. The adaptation of difficulty, the time pressure, all the above, definitely make it an exam that you need to prepare for. So taking a cold 615, I knew I wanted to up those numbers. I settled on the focus specifically because it was a shorter exam. I kind of analyzed the two. I know the old GMAT's got sentence correction, some geometry, writing section, and it's a little bit longer, right? So ended up going to focus. I felt that I could really go do better mentally on a short sprint like that. And then, went for the 615 on the cold mock, decided, all right, it's time to start preparing. Went through TTP for 3 months or so before my first exam. And then, I was able to walk in with a bit more confidence than when I took the first cold mock.
So that's interesting. So you started your prep, I guess, back in what, around September?
About mid-August.
Mid-August, okay, and you opted to go for focus. That's an interesting move. I mean, it obviously worked out. So, you made the right decision. So I think in general, that should make people feel a little bit better. I know at this point, the drop dead date is tomorrow for Classic being retired, but it's a good sign to see someone who chose Focus over Classic, even when you didn't have to, and you were able to prepare very well on it. So, all right, so you take your cold mock, you get a 615, you realize you have some studying to do. So, what was the process like then? Like, how did you come across TTP, or what was the process of looking for resources like?
So to begin, I knew that I knew how little I knew, I guess, about the test itself. So I wanted to look for a program with a lot of structure, just something to kind of make me feel like I knew the test a little bit and to guide me along the subject studying path as well. So avenues to find a program like that. I'm on Reddit all the time, of course. So
Right.
Reddit was kind of my primary source of information. Of course, TTP has a lot of glowing reviews on that website. So that kind of led me to TTP, and then had some budget concerns, wanted to check prices of other programs. And eventually I felt personally that I would get the most bang for my buck going with TTP.
Great, yeah, and you're right. We have a lot of reviews there. We have a lot of reviews on GMAT Club as well, of students, especially using the course for GMAT Focus. So you took the 5-day trial, you liked it. Um, Talk a little bit about how you used Target Test Prep. One thing of note, actually, which I've always found super interesting about your story personally, is that you solely, and I want to make sure I have this exactly correct, which I think I do. You solely use TTP. You didn't use the OG. You did take official practice exams, but you just use Target Test Prep for your practice and your learning, correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay, that's pretty cool, especially because you did so well on the test. Now, getting back to how you used Target Test Prep, we have a study plan, we have all that stuff. You like the structure. So, what was your process of getting through the course?
So started with the diagnostic, of course. Wanted to, I had a little bit of a baseline from the first cold mock, of course, but um, took the diagnostic, decided go with the expert plus. Wanted to get as much information crammed into my brain as possible. Since I was laid off, I work part-time, usually on the weekends. So I was fortunate that I had a lot of time during the week to study and really dedicate myself to the course. Um, so with that being said, I started through the course. I would probably put between 6 to 8 hours in a day, and I
Oh,
knew
wow.
what I had to do to get to the point I wanted to be at before going into exam number one, which I had scheduled to be in early November. I think November 9th was my first date. So I had about 3 months, just under 3 months, to work through the course, which is not a ton of time because there's so much practice to be done and there's a lot of conceptual learning to be done through TTP. But yeah, that was kind of my daily process. Just get nose to the grindstone, try and work my way through about one chapter a day. Of course, some are longer than others, and actually that helped me break up the studying a little bit. So instead of doing just 8 hours a day or 6 hours a
Right.
day, I was okay, we have a shorter chapter today. It's going to be an easy day. It's going to be a 4 hour day for me today. On the other hand, other days might be 9 or 10 hour days, work a
That's
little bit
very
after
easy.
dinner, maybe wrap it up in the morning too. So I'd break my studying up like that, just proceeded sequentially through the material presented, kind of on a mission level basis instead of the going by date. I just kind of was just going to go through it in order as quickly ish as I could, making sure that
Yeah.
I absorbed things before the exam. But yeah, it was all sequential like that. Yeah, and that structure that TTP gave was, I think that was pretty integral to helping me get through that material in a good way.
Right. Yeah, I mean, just impressive all around. I mean, 3 months, you're right. It's not a ton of time. The fact that you strategically took advantage of your free time is great. I wouldn't recommend anyone leave their job to do this, but
Agreed.
if you find yourself in that position where you're like, okay, I don't have a job and I do want to go to business school, taking full advantage of that time is great. And it seems like you were able to pull it off without too much burnout, which is also really impressive. Well, in fact, I guess that's a question. How did you avoid, you're talking about an 8 to 10 hour day. I mean, that's a lot. So did you start to feel it at any point, or were you able to kind of, I mean, I guess when I'm envisioning 10 hours, I'm thinking of you sitting there from like 10 to, you know, uh, whatever, late in the afternoon.
Yeah.
But were you breaking it up strategically so you didn't feel the burnout?
Yeah. So I guess disclaimer when I say I was putting in a 10-hour day, it wasn't me sitting at my laptop
Right.
focused for 10 hours. I'm a big believer that just humans in general, unless you are an outlier, humans only have about two real big spurts of productivity during the day, usually once in the morning and once in the afternoon. So
Mm-hmm.
I would try and take advantage of kind of my mental active periods, right? Those are the times where I really go through material. I would sit down, wouldn't look at my phone, wouldn't look at anything else. Of course, during the rest of the day, you start to feel the fatigue a little bit, but
Right.
I would recommend to anybody that's going to do GMAT studying in general or go through those extended sessions to listen to your body. Because if
Yep.
you go through those inactive periods or those kind of chill times where you're not operating kind of in sixth gear, your studying isn't going to be as effective and you may be wasting time to a certain extent. So, yeah, I
Right.
want to make it clear that I wasn't just absolutely locked into my laptop for every hour of those 6 to 8 to 10. Definitely some chill periods. But to answer the question of general, how I avoided burnout, of course, I'd give myself breaks on the weekends when I would, I'd work in my part-time job, which was
Right.
not really mentally taxing like GMAT study prep is. So that helped. But at the end of the day, while I was trying to pursue the study process on a chapter by chapter, mission by mission basis, I did know that burnout could be an issue for me, as it has been in the past, and like it is for a lot of people. So I think it's really important to listen to your body. If you're feeling like, man, I really, really am just slogging through this chapter today, I'm getting
Mm-hmm.
questions wrong that I know I normally would be getting correct. Listen to your body, give yourself a break, give yourself grace. If you push yourself too hard, at the end of the day, I think it's going to come back to bite you. But it's really important to give yourself breaks and time to kind of recover because you're exercising a muscle, the brain.
Yep.
And on top of that, I took this strategy that I found online of just visualizing the outcome, right? So my goal was to
Mm-hmm.
I wanted to crack into the 700s in general on the GMAT focus. So I'd envision that goal. I'd really just kind of let the emotions wash over me, close my eyes. It was like I was there. And usually it got me a little bit more excited to study. Established a bit of an emotional connection between this goal, this dream of doing well on the test, and the actual steps that it would take to get there.
Yeah, that's cool. And you did that daily, this kind of visualization,
Yeah,
or
it
is that
was maybe not necessarily on a schedule, but there were a lot of
right?
times where I felt like I mentioned earlier, like, oh, getting through this chapter is just really wearing me down right now.
Mm-hmm.
Let's take a pause, let's take a break. And then when I'd go to sit back at the table, I'd kind of just take a couple deep breaths, close my eyes, and yeah, I guess vision work. I guess you could call it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess when you're in the midst of a chapter, right, and you're like, man, this is such a slog. If you can picture yourself, kind of just crushing that question from that chapter, I mean, that's pretty cool, I would say. Um, and yeah, I think it definitely helps because it kind of probably gives you that motivation to keep going on those days when you're like, wow, this is not fun. And I mean, it's day after day, and you were doing this 7 days a week, right?
Yeah, I'd actually mostly I would do 5 days a week. So I would just work GMAT stuff from home Monday to Friday, and then since I
Hmm.
work on the weekends at my other job, that's how I'd spend my weekend time normally.
Okay, cool. And talk about, what some of the things that were really helpful in the TTP course as you went through it. Obviously, we have an organized study plan. I'm sure that was super helpful. But how did you kind of use the course to your advantage? And I believe you did complete the entire thing, but talk a little bit about all that.
Sure. So, like I mentioned earlier on this morning, I was looking for a program with really strong structure, um, kind of something to guide me along the way because I didn't really, well, I didn't want to do all of the research and break down the study plan myself independently of TTP and say, okay, I need to really focus on these concepts. I kind of wanted to act like I was starting out fresh, right? And I wanted to go from the very beginning. So structure is one of the things that really sold me on TTP. Breaking it up on a mission by mission basis with chapter review quizzes, mission review tests, practicing problems within the conceptual learning process. The way that it's broken down, the procedure that you prescribe to the students is something that really helped me along the way for sure. On top of the structure, the actual sequence of chapters I found to be really, it was pretty sensible. Early chapters being a bit more basic, a bit more fundamental, like, properties of numbers. That's a great first or second quant chapter that you learn. And you could really employ those tactics and those lessons throughout the rest of the more complex chapters. So, and to speak to verbal, I think find the assumption is one of the first two chapters. That is also an employable type of strategy mindset for the rest of the verbal chapters as well. So I think starting out with those basic fundamentals, learning the strategic and actual conceptual elements that'll help you later on down the road, that helped me out a lot. And then the third thing that for me was I think this was the game changer for me, but the strategy chapters where every so often you're instructed to read through the strategy guide. Right. This is what the test is going to be like. This is, if you get test anxiety, here are some strategies that that you should employ when you're actually in the test center, on your way to the test center. You instruct to go in with confidence. You've done the work. There's no reason to be anxious because you have studied so hard and you're just going to crush it. So taking that mindset in with me from the strategy chapter, I think was game changer number 3 from TTP.
Good. And did you you talked about the order of the stuff. So there's 2 things that we did pretty strategically in the course. Now, you don't have like a basis of comparison because you didn't do like classic, but number 1 is we kept the data sufficiency questions. We removed any pure math DS questions. Those are not in GMAT Focus. I'm sure you can confirm that. You didn't see any questions like, well, we don't need to talk about what you saw, actually. That's not for today. But there's no pure math and data sufficiency in Focus. What we did do is we kept DS more or less in the quant section because 90% of DS, we're adding a few verbal criteria-based DS lessons now, actually. Those will be in there, but the majority is still math topics. So you learned DS along with statistics and ratios and so you noticed that. And I assume that was helpful for you rather than...
Yes. Oh, yeah, because data sufficiency questions, of course, many would agree, are kind of a different beast when you compare it to the rest of the questions that appear on the GMAT Focus. So it really checks your understanding. It necessitates that you kind of have an inside and out memory and knowledge of the concepts that you're learning. So yeah, I loved the strategy of having those DS questions as practice in the middle of a chapter for sure.
Awesome. Okay, cool. Yeah, and that's where they'll stay. As I tell students a lot, that's the best place for you to learn DS. Just because the GMAT has moved them to data insights doesn't mean that's just the test. We care more about the learning for our students, and that's why they're still there. And then what's really cool is data insights, which is the rest of it: integrated reasoning, MSR, TPA, TA, graphics interpretation, GI. That's still at the end of the study plan. And I assume you noticed a lot of the skills, even verbal, in addition to quant, are necessary to succeed in those DI questions. So when you got there, were you like, oh, this is cool. I have my stat skills, my ratio skills, etc., critical reasoning skills. Now it's just a matter of practicing these question types?
Totally. I think it was the stats chapter, of course, is really, really relevant for all the DI questions. I know, within the course and on the test, there are a lot of statistics related questions that come up in DI. So yeah, I really did feel prepared from a conceptual basis, and working through the DI section, it was more of getting familiar with the type of information and the format that is presented on the test. Kind of going back through checking my knowledge of graphs, of charts, things like that. There are some gotchas that I know TTP is aware of, like different y-axis scales,
Yep.
things that you really have to be careful of and pay attention to if you don't want to commit a simple error that you otherwise wouldn't have made. So
Right.
conceptually, I felt prepared, and it was just about familiarization for me once I got to that section.
Great. So, all right. So you cruise through the study plan, you do the chapter tests, you're taking notes, you're using your error log, et cetera, et cetera. So then you get to the practice test phase. Now you did all of the practice exams that were offered by GMAT. I don't know if they had all of them ready by the time you took the test or not, but you ended up taking all of them.
Yeah, I was able to do all 6.
Okay, awesome. And as you're getting into those tests, did you find, wow, this is pretty damn relatable to the stuff that I just did in TTP?
Definitely. I felt taking my first practice exam. I mean, my first practice exam after I finished TTP, I was in the 700s. I think I got a
Hmm.
715 actually on the first one that I took after I finished the program. So conceptually, I felt prepared. I
Right.
didn't really feel surprised by anything that came up. Of course, there were some areas where I felt that I needed to kind of bolster my strength. Areas that I would I think for me, it was like quotient rules, and that was just an area of weakness for me personally. So I
Right.
would go through the practice exams, keep my error log, maintain that error log, and then statistically, I'd see, okay, I'm not doing so well here. And so, yeah, reinforcing the concepts was pretty straightforward, I'd say. But what was the big improvement for me was test pace and strategy.
Right.
So taking those practice exams, kind of dialing in that internal clock that you
Hmm.
train over time, taking your mock exams. Of course, you have the clock in front of you, obviously, that tells you how long you're taking, how long you have left.
Right.
So using that to your advantage and making sure that that strategy is pretty bulletproof. That was the main thing for me. And then on top of that, um, like choice strategy, I guess. So, there's a lot of instruction on that within TTP. Like usually for verbal, you can eliminate quant for that matter too. You can eliminate 3 answers that typically are not really close to the actual solution, and then
Hmm.
going from there. And maybe you need to come back to that question. That was a big thing for me to practice on the mocks as well.
Right. So content wise, you were happy with where everything was at, basically. So you
Definitely.
felt like, okay, this is jiving with what I learned in TTP. So there were no huge surprises. That's awesome to hear. And then it was more about just honing in on test taking strategy. And I assume those good vibes kind of carried through to test day. You took your first test. I think you said you got a 715. Did you feel content wise, okay, I'm still in this game. What I've learned is super applicable to what I just saw, more or less?
Definitely. Yeah, I know that I had a really good understanding of all the topics that are presented. Um, there wasn't really any question that came up on the actual exam where I felt truly surprised of what was in front of me. I
Hmm.
felt that every question I saw I'd seen before in one way or another, minus, a couple very, very minor differences, which is to be expected on the actual exam. But yeah, nothing was really surprising. I actually, though, I did make kind of a, a grievous error on the exam. I lost track of time. I got so absorbed in the last question on the quant section that I didn't lock in my answer before the time expired. And that was just
Oh
a
wow.
personal, that was my own error. So I think I maybe otherwise would have scored a little bit higher that time, which in the end kind of triggered me to sit down for the exam one more time because I felt like I could have done better. But yes, to answer your question, nothing was really unexpected when I actually got to the real exam.
Interesting. And what were your score on your practice exams? Like, kind of your range, because I'm sure people are wondering, hey, did things match up from practice to real? So yeah, how did that look?
So it was my mock exams were a little not all over the place, but the range may be wider than for some other students. I think my lowest, and these did not come in sequence. I think my lowest
Right.
exam was the fourth mock that I took, and the highest was my third. So I scored, my lowest mock was a 685 or
Hmm.
695, if I remember correctly. And my highest mock was a 745. So my first score, I think, was kind of right at or below my overall average. And
Okay.
of course, my second and final real exam attempt was higher than any mock that I had actually taken myself.
Okay. So everything kind of matched up. That means, anxiety, the things that, we could struggle with, test A jitters. I mean, you name it. It sounds like none of that had a huge negative effect on you. So, all right. So this is great. So you took your test. You got a 715. You realized you made an error. Um, so the mindset was, hey, I'd be happy with a 715, but I have nothing to lose by retaking. Is that kind of what you thought? After
Definitely.
that first exam? Yeah.
Yeah, I was originally I had kind of assumed that I would take the exam 3 times total.
Oh wow.
Um,
Okay.
of course, that was maybe just the max that I set for myself. I didn't think it was worth taking it more than 3 times, especially since I was a little late in the game in terms of taking that before sending out my applications for round 2 for MBA programs. So, um, took it the first time. I felt happy, of course. I mean, I think 715 is like
Yeah.
98.7th percentile, something like that. So yeah, I was really, really
Good.
happy with the score itself. But since A, I committed the error, and B, it was my first time taking the exam, I felt that I had reason enough to take it again. I felt like I could have done better. Like I was maybe a few points away from my ceiling. And, ideally I wanted to reach the ceiling, of course. So I was, very diligent in my this is a strategy that I would recommend to everybody. I had meticulously planned every element of my test day from when I woke up, when I was taking the test, kind of looking inward about when my brain is at its highest level of functionality. I
Hmm.
actually changed my test time from the first time I took the test was in the morning. I think it was an 8 or 8:30 a.m. test, and I'm usually more of an afternoon person. So that I didn't go into the test with the best breakfast. So
Yeah.
on attempt number 2, I had a solid lunch, not too heavy, not too light.
Right.
Um, Moment I left the door was planned almost down to the second. But
Hmm.
yeah, between tests, I thought that I could improve my strategy and reduce some of that anxiety because I'm definitely prone to the jitters and
Right.
had to employ the breathing exercises
All right.
um, and all that. So yeah, that was kind of one of the difference makers between test day 1 and test day 2.
Yeah, I mean that's all super important stuff. I would say that's all relevant to success. I mean, if you're thrown off, I mean, because the GMAT is such a touchy test. So if one thing doesn't go your way and you're just not in the right headspace to absorb it, then you can easily falter. And I've seen students who are well prepared, and then from an anxiety perspective, they just crumble on the test. So yeah, that all makes a lot of sense. Now, there's a few questions here. Some of them you've kind of answered. We could just repeat it again. Someone's asked, how long did it take you to go through the entire TTP course, and under which difficulty? And did you come from a strong quant background, or learn most from the ground up?
Yeah, so I began my prep, as I mentioned earlier, in beginning middle August. And then I first took the exam November 9th and the second on the 29th of November. So in total, it was August, September, October, November, about 4 months of prep, maybe a little bit less. There were, you know, times during that process where I was going through the course at, a bit faster, a bit slower rates. But for the most part, it was a pretty consistent pace for me. And like I mentioned earlier, I had just, nothing but time during my weekdays to dedicate myself to GMAT prep. So that was kind of the process that I followed. Difficulty wise, I set it to expert plus. I kind of wanted to shoot for the stars. I knew I needed a really high GMAT score if I wanted to actually have a shot at getting into any of the programs that I wanted to target. And then let's see, there was a third question, but I can't remember what it was.
Did you have a strong quant background prior, or did you learn from the ground up?
I would say I had a pretty strong quant background. I took a lot of math and computer science in college, and I was a software engineer before I began preparing for the GMAT. So in terms of background, I would say quant is probably what would have been my strong suit. Of course, there were areas, it's being a software engineer is not being a mathematician, obviously. So there were mathematical concepts that I really needed to recover, but it was more of a refresher in most ways than it was presenting new material. So I would say I wasn't really working from the ground up. I had a decent foundation when it comes to quantitative questions like that.
Right. Cool. So another question was about pacing, your timing strategy, and how to, I guess part of it's related to verbal. I think the overarching question is like, how did you deal with verbal timing, especially because SC is where sometimes you can make up for time. So what was the process like for you? And I mean, you can talk about timing in all the sections. Honestly, I think it'd be useful for people to hear.
Of course, yeah, timing is definitely one of the biggest, I think, pitfalls that a student, just from my experience, if you mess up your timing, you spend 8 minutes on one question, it's going to be really, really difficult to get through all the rest of the questions with enough time where you can actually answer to the best of your ability. So glad we're talking about timing, of course. Verbal was the section on which I felt, I don't know why, I guess just kind of innately, I got through with enough time to go back and check my answers. Of course, you get 3 answer switches on the test itself. So bookmarking questions you don't feel confident on is a necessary component to the timing strategy. On both of my exams. So I got a 90 on verbal on both exams, and the biggest part of that was timing strategy. So I would go through, I'd read the question. If for some reason I felt like, what are they trying to say here? I don't even have an inkling of what the assumption is here. I would look through the answers. If nothing really popped out to me, bookmark, move on to the next question. There's no reason you need to spend a lot of time on a question you may otherwise just get wrong anyways. So that was my strategy there. And maybe against intuition for most people, the reading comprehension sections were when I recovered time. So of course, those sections are longer in terms of reading. There's a lot of words there, and some of those passages were admittedly very dense. I think on both exams, there was one passage that was just like, oh my gosh, I really had to, like TTP instructs, I had to get myself excited to read this passage, get interested in the material, right?
Say that all the time, yep.
But getting through that actually, like against intuition, that's where I recovered time. You go through that passage and you make your notes on your paper if that's your strategy, or you kind of like highlight specific sentences in your minds, certain facts that you want to carry with you through the questions. Move through the passage and you have 4 or 5 questions kind of at a bare minimum for those passages where if you had a great comprehension of that passage, you will kind of, I would recommend going and making sure you have a sentence to reference to back the solution that you choose. But if you have a good mental map of the structure of the passage, that for me is where I gained back a lot of my time that I spent on the other shorter questions.
Yeah. And, one of the interesting things I always find about reading comprehension, I'm noticing it with MSR questions, is that despite having these long passages that are very bulky and time consuming to get through, they do kind of give you breaks where they know as you cycle through the questions, you're going to become more and more familiar with the passage. So there may be a line in the passage or a paragraph that you go back to 3 or 4 times, but it's not going to take you as long the second or third time to go back to that paragraph because you've already seen it and you kind of know what's in it. So that's
Exactly.
something that I think helps with that.
Yeah,
Um,
and on top of that, I mean, one of the possible questions that you receive on those passages is structure of the argument. How is the argument being made, right? That's, that
right.
comes up pretty frequently. So when you're reading the passage, if you deliberately try and remember how the argument is structured and how the passage is structured, I mean,
Right.
those are one and the same essentially. Then you're exactly like you said, when the time comes that you need to go back and find a sentence or two to back up your answer, having that
Hmm.
knowledge kind of at the front of your mind is definitely going to save you some time there.
Yeah, that's true. And if you're practicing reading comp, or we talk about reading magazines and
Yeah.
articles, you can do that when you're doing that. Um, Other questions, I can answer this one. Did you also go through the entire OG book? The answer to that is no. You just went through TTP. Um, your pacing in data insights section, shifting from. So someone's basically saying that the DI stuff is tricky. What was your pacing like in the DI section?
Yeah, tricky is, I would say, a pretty apt word to describe DI from the pacing side of things. That was
Hmm.
definitely the section I felt like I was struggling the most on for time
Right.
because digesting those charts sometimes can be pretty taxing. Can take a
Yep.
lot of mental effort and time, of course. So there were some questions where I really felt, okay, this is straightforward. This is I'm looking at this graph and I know I got to go get through this quickly. Let's hurry up and answer and move on, of course, without sacrificing your accuracy.
Yep.
So yeah, it definitely requires some practice. Luckily there's no shortage of that on TTP. So um, that helped. Doing timed questions for DI and going through, mini quizzes or custom tests on a time pressure scale, super, super helpful for getting that practice in and kind of knowing how to quickly get through a question that may not be otherwise easily digested through
Right.
practice. That's the only thing I think that I can prescribe there.
Did you notice, like, in that section, for example, TA questions, table analysis, were those some of the questions where you're like, okay, this is a little bit easier. This is where I'm going to make up on some of my time. Okay, yeah, that.
Yeah, table analysis for sure, because you can just sort the table yourself, and that
Right,
that makes things a lot easier. But for some, like a histogram or a bar chart,
right,
there's not a ton of sorting to be done there. You just got to look at it, look at the axes, look at the labels, and just kind of process it on your own instead of sorting anything.
right. So the soft spots in DI, you would say, are table analysis. And did you find that with data sufficiency too? Like, okay, I can kind of make up some ground timing wise with DS questions, or were those still relatively difficult and time consuming?
For me personally, and of course, I mean, anything that I say today, I would preface with a disclaimer saying everyone's different, right? This is just my experience, of course, but my experience was that DS I spent on average more time on. Um,
Hmm.
there were some shorter questions. I mean, I did, and anybody that goes through the whole entirety of the TTP program, I think will find this. There were some questions that were non-data sufficiency questions where honestly, like, the question read itself to me and answered itself, because if you practice enough, TTP prepares you to answer so many different questions, and there's only
Right,
so many formats that you can follow to test on certain concepts. So
right,
I would say those shorter questions where I really just felt like it's almost like I saw this in a dream last night, those questions I would make up a lot of time on, and I would actually try and bank that time a little bit for data sufficiency, because you may or may not, depending on what the solution actually is, have to test your theory in multiple ways for data sufficiency. For example, you need to maybe test if statement one alone is acceptable, is enough data to answer the question. Same with number
Right.
two. And if one nor the other are sufficient, then you have to do both of them in conjunction with one another, testing that you have enough information. So I was I would really emphasize, because data sufficiency was such a struggle for me, that I had to really work hard on the test to prove my solution. So I'd save time for that and make
Right.
it up elsewhere on quant.
All right, cool. Yeah, I think, a lot of people are kind of a little worried about DI because of, it used to be integrated reasoning. Now it is counting towards your overall score. But I do think the fact that they're testing you on skills that you already know from learning verbal and quant does make it better. And then, yeah, you got to get used to seeing a lot of those different question types as you, move through that section. So it is that getting used to that is probably something new, but it's doable. And yes, I know you said that was your weaker of the three sections, but the cool thing is, and someone mentioned this the other day, is if you know you have a weaker section and you know you have a stronger section, as long as you come in really well in the stronger section, it can pull everything else up. So you can have a weaker section of three as long as you perform, well in the other two sections. And clearly that's what happened to you.
Yeah, exactly. I
Um,
only got an 8 for my 755. I only got an 83 raw score and data insights. So yeah,
right.
I'd agree exactly with what you said.
Cool. All right. So you took the test twice. You bumped up your score. We've talked a little bit about timing on the exam. We talked about how you use target test prep. I guess in general, like there's always new students cycling in and out of this GMAT process, or students retaking the test. Like, what's some just kind of macro advice you could give to anyone here or anyone watching this recording about, just preparation in general for the GMAT, the things that worked for you, the things in retrospect you look back at and you're super happy with what you did?
Um, that's a good question. I'd say first, if you're working through TTP, I think one of the first things that they tell you is that, hey, we've worked really hard to curate this content in a very specific way, and you should follow it to the letter if you can. I think that that's true. I would recommend that for anybody working through the program. There's a lot of good advice in there. I mean, anxiety strategies, taking notes, maintaining an error log, working through every quiz. Do it all if you have time. And on that note, make sure you do have enough time before you take the actual exam, because if you
Right.
try and rush through the program and rush through the material before you take the exam, I'm skeptical that you will see the same results as if instead of giving yourself enough time. So make
Right.
sure you have enough time. Don't rush. That would also cause you to stress out more, which hinders your learning ability in itself as well. So take
Yep.
enough time if you can. I would also recommend, this is not something that I personally did, and I wish I did, like working on your habits while, like, not just test habits, but life habits. Like I said earlier, on test days, I was very, very meticulous in my planning about when I would wake up, when I would eat, what I would eat, how much water I would drink, how much caffeine I would intake before the exam, what music I would listen to on my way to the
Yep.
exam. I would recommend doing all of that before you actually go to the exam and while you're doing your preparations, so that you're not deviating from any routine in any drastic ways, that it's just second nature. So on test day, it's almost like any other day. Instead of doing your prep, you're just going to a test center, or doing it at home, of course, and doing it for real. That's going to be the only difference if you get your habits in line before you go.
Yeah, I agree. And just about timeline, that's always such an interesting question. Um, I always tell people, because and I'm sure you've seen this on the forums, and like, oh, TTP is going to take you X amount of time, right? Well, you got done in 3 months. But what I'm always telling students is, this isn't a TTP question. It's a you question. Like, you want to be done with the GMAT in 2 months? Take TTP out of it, right? Take any prep course you want to use. can you be ready in 2 months? And a lot of people can't. So it's not really the question of, does TTP get me there in this amount of time? It's, can I get there in this amount of time, irrespective of resources, etc. So it's kind of going about what you just said. And yeah, you do really need to consider timelines. I think the fact that the classic test is done and people can just focus now is helpful, because now they're not trying to like jam a test in at the last minute. So
Right.
yeah, I mean, I think you did it perfectly. You knew, you set it out in your head. You knew the time you could dedicate daily, weekly, and you executed. And yeah, I think there's a lot that people can learn from you. Like, sometimes people are like, do I really gotta visualize, or do I really want to focus on my breathing, and these are things that clearly helped you. And as they say, the proof's in the pudding here. You got a 755, which is again like insane. So obviously all of those things added up to be super successful for you.
Yeah, and on top of that, there are those strategies that worked for me, but I would say to any individual student that during your prep process, it's not just about learning the concepts and learning how to take the test. I discovered those tactics while I was preparing. I figured out what worked for me personally because, like I said, everybody's different. Maybe breathing in a certain way that's calming for others makes you have a panic attack or something like that, right? Like it's
Right.
all about just finding what works for you and then practicing those strategies and then finally employing them for real on test day. So dialing
Right.
in your personal, your mental prep, I would say is just as important as the actual material and the conceptual preparation.
Yeah, totally agree. So yeah, this is great, man. I think there's a ton people can learn from this interview. So hopefully, for those that aren't here live, they're going to be able to watch this, the recording of this. Um, and I really appreciate you, sitting down and explaining your process. And like I said, this GMAT focus is new. People are nervous, so I think your story is going to be really, really beneficial for people kind of jumping in, or people having to pivot from the classic, as that ends in about a day from now, on the 31st of January. Um, yeah. So, do you have any last minute thoughts, or do you think we have everything kind of covered here?
I think we've covered pretty much everything, Jeff,
All
from beginning to end. But I would say if I were to leave one bit of parting advice to any students listening out there, anybody preparing for the exam, you're going to do great. I've never met you, but I believe in you. You should
There you
believe in
go.
yourself, and that's the key to success on an exam like the GMAT.
There you go. All right. Well, with that, everybody, thanks again, Connor. Thanks, everybody, for hanging out. And I'm sure I'll be back. And we'll all talk soon. So thanks again, everybody, and have a good rest of your week.
You too, Jeff. Thank you very
Bye,
much.
Connor. Thanks, buddy.